In this week's episode, we're joined by David McIntosh. He's the host of the Development by David podcast. It's a podcast where he shares origin stories as a self-development tool. We had a lot of fun with David. We learned a lot from David. He's had some fantastic big name guests on his podcast. People like Rory Sutherland, Jimmy Carr, who he shamelessly name drops throughout this. No, I'm joking. The Jimmy podcast is very worthwhile watching. I enjoyed that a lot. As ever, we're going to start this off by having a look at the behind the scenes photos shot by our very own and very talented Dallin. All of David's stuff, David McIntosh that is this time, will be linked in the description below, and we really hope you enjoyed this as much as we did. Enjoy. I was going for a cool transition there. That's better.
Okay, so this is take two. Our first take of the podcast with David from Development by David. I'm sure you recognise him. We had ice creams dripping all over the hands, dripping all over the trousers. I don't know if we've got some footage to show.
There was nothing more obscure than that visual of us sitting on rocks down the beach with dripping ice creams. You've got sunshades on, so you look even worse. Well, like trousers on, that's like a kind of visual obscurity. I'm wearing all black. Like by the end of this podcast, you're going to be scooping me off this fucking rock.
How did you find the photo shoot? I really enjoyed it.
I felt visually exposed. I loved it. Like it's one of the things I love about this podcast. It's such an intimate insight into someone's life. Like the way they actually pose and their visual hand gestures, I think says quite a lot about their confidence or bravado. And I think it was brilliant. It was so much fun. Like this is such a sentimental area for me. I spent every day of every summer down this beach skateboarding. I was such a misfit as a kid, and skateboarding wasn't cool. It wasn't glamorized like it is in like Tony Hawk's Pro Skaters. I mean, like you look like a fucking extra from that game. I'd pay £4 to unlock you. But honestly, I love this area. Like it's so sentimental. So being able to shoot some cool photos here was a privilege. And like I said, I'm a huge fan of the podcast and its premise. So thank you.
Class, thank you. And likewise as well. I know we've talked about that before, but for context, if you don't recognise where we are, we're next to Kids Play. That's what it's called now, yeah.
Costa del Cunso.
Costa del Cunso. I genuinely haven't been down here since it was Go Bananas. I didn't get it for like a birthday party. So it's quite a cool area.
That's cool.
Wee concrete seals, which might feature later on as well.
Oh no.
So, one of the main things, just while it's on my mind, that I want to talk to you about. I work for a bank, and I hate the idea of any of them knowing I've got a podcast or. Did the camera go off there? Oh no, it's Struan's camera. I hate the idea of any of them like knowing I have a podcast, and I can't even imagine like doing comedy and thinking like, oh, like someone I work with on a professional basis has like seen me or saw a clip or something. So like, how do you handle that? Because you kind of juggle all three.
Yeah. At first I was very dubious of that. I think it would be a lie if someone said they brought their whole self to work all of the time.
Yeah.
They bring the best version of themselves that's suited to that environment.
Yeah.
So at first when I started this endeavour, both comedy and podcasting, because you don't have the reps in, you don't have that undeniable stack of proof that you are a podcaster or you are a comedian, you're not embracing that part of your identity. So when you go into the organisation that you work for, you're not proud enough at that point to say that's you.
It's like wearing a new hat.
It's wearing a new hat, yeah. But over time, like training that muscle, that comedic muscle or the podcasting muscle, and getting the stack of proof that you are a podcaster or a comedian, you then start to bring that into work and people start to celebrate that with you. Like I've interviewed our CEO at KPMG, which was amazing. And I cracked jokes there, and because people knew I was a podcaster and people knew I did stand-up comedy, that just made sense at that point. It wasn't a violation of an expectation. But previously I had to disguise that for so long. But it feels so great that I'm at a point where people recognise that that's what I do outside of work. They celebrate it. They actually bring me opportunities in the workplace that bring out those sides of me. I think that's great from internal dialogue point of view, because you can hide yourself under so many layers that you don't recognise yourself any longer. And if you're going into a workplace for 8 hours and you're wearing a facade or a mask, that's damaging to your personal identity, because you're not being able to bring a part of yourself that you're so proud about. So when I was able to just embrace my extracurricular facets of my life, I think I started to enjoy work a bit more. I think it's been hard. It's been hard.
Do you remember like the first time people caught wind of you having a podcast or that you did stand up?
I can't really remember, to be honest. I did have one gig where someone that I don't work closely with, who doesn't follow me on social media, came to one of my stand-up comedy gigs.
Okay.
Or not my gigs, it was a Red Raw at the Stand, and I died on my arse.
Oh, no.
Like, I saw them walk in, I was like, fuck.
Yeah.
And then I took the gig on like 30 minutes notice. Someone pulled out, it was my first Red Raw, and I didn't die on my arse completely, but it wasn't a like take the roof off type Red Raw that you would expect or would want. And I was like, fuck, I'm going to have to go into work tomorrow. And they've told everyone around them that David's a stand-up comedian and he's shite. But yeah, I do remember that. But I think it's important, if you do have these extracurricular facets, like with what you do with the podcast and your love for stand-up, and same with me, I think it's important that you showcase it as soon as possible, because then like you can't get cancelled for making a joke in the workplace, because people are like, well, he's a stand-up comedian, he's allowed to say those things. Like, he's saying it in jest, whereas if you actually crack a kind of relatively funny joke and it's out of context, or people don't expect you to say it because you're an accountant or you work in financial compliance, for example, then people are going to be like, what? Whereas like if you kind of preface the fact that you're a stand-up comedian, then they're more accepting to you being that true version of yourself, I guess.
You're really, you're quite insightful for your age. I know we covered that on the first take, but I do want to make that point again. Like, it is, I do respect that, and I think that's what makes you a good podcaster. Is I was surprised to see you like shaking your head when I asked about therapy, because the insight you've got is pretty. I don't even know how to end that sentence. That's how thick I am. But do you know what I mean? You do have a lot of insight. You can like verbalize all these feelings and have that stance of like seeing the wider picture and stuff like that, and so many things.
Yeah, I think one key component of that is to give yourself moments of solitude. I think in this current environment where you have Uber Eats on demand, you have content at your fingertips, there is a lesser propensity for people to be bored now. We don't spend time in bored states because we've always got something to fill that void. So moments of solitude whereby like turning the radio off in the car when you've got a long drive, or meditating, or doing those kind of mindfulness practices, they've been really important for giving myself space and permission to access those thoughts, make sense of them, and try and develop either something funny or insightful from them. And a lot of the bigger events in my life happened during the pandemic, and we were very much in solitude most of the time. So that was a real keystone for me to like learn about the importance of creating that environment. I learned how to like deal with the loss of my mum immediately after losing her, because we were forced into a pandemic. But also, I was speaking about this with Jimmy Carr a few weeks ago, about how you don't need to live a long life to live a long life. And what I mean by that is that what makes an exciting life is a radical amount of novel and intense experiences. So being the age of 24, I've had loads of those. Not all positive, like a lot of them have been front-loaded with hardship growing up. And I feel like I'm like 35, 40 because I've had so much going on in my life from such a young age. So I think like that's such a nice compliment that you said I'm like mid-20s and I'm quite introspective, but I think it's because I have had such a front-loaded life of so many really intense experiences, or very novel and unique experiences. And I would encourage the listener, or encourage anyone to seek a remarkable life by forcibly putting novelty and intensity into your life. So like sign up for that skydive, do that comedy course, ask the girl out, put yourself in a new environment. It's like the reason, like, if you take the same drive to work every single day, your brain stores that as one drive, unless you had to take a random detour because a fire truck was on fire. Ironically, you would remember that as a distinct, like, drive to work. You know, so I think like a foundational or fundamental practice for someone is to actively do something every day that is just a little bit different, because what we'll do will like train the synapses in your brain to remember that as something unique. Like, brush your teeth with your left hand whilst reciting a poem or something. You know, like, do something randomly different to train your brain.
Student does that.
He does a lot of things, that boy. That doesn't surprise me. Yeah.
No, I really like that, and I would highly recommend anyone watching obviously the Jimmy Carr episode and stuff like that, but episode 100, where it's kind of delving into your past and what makes you who you are today. I don't want to like rehash too much of that today, and because like it's a good episode in its own right. I don't want to just like steal some of the stories, but yeah, I'd highly recommend people watching that. And if you're looking for something new to do, subscribe. That's the one.
You'll remember this day. You'll remember the day you subscribe to this.
So, what did you start first with? Was it podcasting or comedy?
It was podcasting.
Podcasting, right?
Yeah, it was in 20... The idea was birthed at the end of 2020. It was launched January 2021, I believe. It was very much a lockdown endeavour, but it was kick-started by an event that happened in 2020. So, for context sake, beginning of 2020, I lost my mum, thrown into a pandemic. In the end of 2020, I was asked to speak to Her Majesty the Queen over Zoom. And I shared a very much similar story to what I shared in episode 100, a very snapshot of that with Her Majesty the Queen. And that was facilitated by my work, but because the Queen's Zoom crashed, no shit, like her Wi-Fi in Windsor Castle. Yeah. Like her Zoom crashed, and like that was part of the press release, and it went viral on Sky News, CNN, went off the charts, and like people within my work and outside of my work would say things like, David, I've got a very similar story to you. I grew up in a council estate, or I got free school meals, but I wouldn't be so brave to share it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I realised, well, that's a pitiful shame that people can't just be themselves. And then I was reminded by the fact that I didn't have anyone who were role models in my world doing that as well.
Yeah.
So I wanted to create a podcast that uses origin stories as a self-development tool. And that was sprung out of me sharing mine.
Yeah.
A very short snippet of mine for the first time, and realising the power of just the origin. And I started off, episode 1 was with a woman called Jen Gillies Pemberton from Irvine. She's now a charity owner and CEO of a social value company based out of Manchester. She's a fascinating story of being a young dyslexic woman and making it as basically creating her own path as a CEO. And I bumped into her in a taxi from Glasgow Paisley Airport, or whatever it's called, Glasgow Airport.
Yeah.
And I couldn't afford my taxi, or I had a card, I didn't have any cash, and she turned back and asked me into her taxi, and we just had a chat of her origin story in the taxi. And
did you have the idea of the podcast in mind at this time, or just
no? Just connecting our origin stories. But when I started the podcast, I thought, well, who can I have on?
Yeah.
Like she was the one, and yeah, over 100 episodes in now, like literally being able to interview heroes such as Jimmy Carr, or a very early hero, Sir Tom Hunter, Scotland's richest man and first billionaire, have been really like sentimental milestones for the podcast. But equally, I love just sharing normal stories of normal people in Glasgow and learning from that too. Yeah.
No, it's interesting what you say about not having a role model that shared their story. I find personally, like, my certain facets of my life that I think might be good for some people to hear, it's not all down to me to share, if you know what I mean. Like, it affects other people. They might be embarrassed by me sharing something about one of their family members or that kind of thing. So I have that, and I've heard people sharing similar stories, and I do like appreciate it, and it does help listening to that kind of thing. And like you're saying, the kind of role modeling and stuff. Like Bill Burr's a big one. I don't know if you've ever seen the clip of him. He's in like a stand-up set in some basement, and he's chatting about his dad at Christmas, and he does something. He tears up, and it's quite an emotional watch. And then years later, he's in one of his specials, he's turned it into this brilliant joke, and like everyone's like just absolutely pissing themselves laughing. So it was like such a good, like, I listened to the Monday morning podcast like way back in the day, and just seeing him like turn that trauma into like a great bit, and you can see he's just thrown it away, he doesn't care anymore, he's not got that kind of, I mean, he's obviously saying the joke hundreds of times, but it was like a good solid win. And Bill Burr's like my comedy guy, absolutely. Who are like your comedy influences then? Like,
Well, just to go back on that point, I think that's such a superpower of comedy, is that when you learn or develop or embrace that comedy gear in your gearbox, you can then like address something that would be typically sensitive or traumatic with a new lens, and you can embrace it through a joke or a bit. Like I said, I lost my mum, not to labour that point. I'm not looking for someone like a woman to pity me on this and like be my sugar mum or something like that. But like that was something that I didn't get just based on where I was in my life, like coming from where I came from. I didn't have access to therapy or support or any people that were actually available to nurture me through that. I had to be very self-sufficient, and the only way I dealt with that was by signing up for a stand-up comedy course and making my first set about my mum.
okay.
And because I was able to like revisit the whole experience, which included getting a phone call in the gym from my dad saying my mum had collapsed, racing home to the front door to see my mum lying on a hallway, getting resuscitated by paramedics, like having to see my mum die on the floor where my dad's struggling to save her, the dog's going nuts, seeing visibly seeing the fucking what do you call it, the stretcher marks on the grass, like loads of visceral, punching, traumatic experiences. Being able to like process that by going back and analysing it, looking for the funnies in the moment, allowed me to address the whole situation and accept it, but also understand that in the grand scheme of things, life goes on and it's not the end of the world. And just accepting it was great. And then being able to turn that around into my first set and making other people like normalise grief and also laugh at that experience was such a superpower. And then like having that gear in my arsenal now, like I'm constantly on the lookout for funnies on the worst of days. And I think I wish everyone had that gear. Like I was going to a gig last night in East Kilbride, and I was picking up the headliner, a guy called Scott Agnew, who's like
I know Scott,
amazing guy. And he was just telling me about a story when he was a journalist. It's not my story to share, but in Snapshot, he told me that he had to visit a house whereby this woman died on Hogmanay, and she wasn't noticed for like 2 or 3 days, and her like 8 or 9 kids were still in the house screaming.
Oof.
And someone spotted her. They had to go report on the story, and I think she was like a kind of alcoholic. Absolute kind of devastating story. The house wasn't that nice. And apparently, like one of the other journalists or the photographer opened the door and said something like, "I must have been the smell that killed her," and like it was such a like break of the tension when like obviously that's so traumatic. Like 8 or 9 kids are left alone without a mother, but like that photographer's ability to just break the expectation, relieve the tension, make everyone feel a bit more comfortable in that environment was a strong account of that. And like Scott told me that last night, and like I didn't know whether to laugh or cry at that story. It was brilliant. But it seems like every comedian that I've met has that gear in them now, and they utilise it all the time. So I think Bill Burr being able to like once tell a story and then transform it into a bit is like the highest leveraged kind of showcase of that gear.
Yeah. No, I like that. I like that you said you're always looking for the funny, even if you have like a bad day or something like that. Yeah,
you can find a funny in everything. Like I was dry humping that seal like 15 minutes ago. Like,
cut to a photo.
oh, I shouldn't have. Yeah, I think it's important though. Like our evolutionary standard state is play, and both capitalism, employment, news headlines, like everything just kind of forms us into this grave, bog standard default mode whereby humour in play seems like childish. But that's like kids know how to play and laugh before they know how to talk.
Yeah.
And we should be embracing that side of ourselves because we've all got it, male or female. There's no biological difference in terms of humour and telling funnies either. And I think I'm definitely going to have to cut that out.
Yeah.
Do you mean like the DJs, like trance?
Let me just denumb my arse for a second.
Do you want to help with that?
Yeah, so you're saying earlier that through bringing like your genuine self at work and you've got your comedy and podcasting and people know that and that's fine and you're still doing your job. How did that lead up to you like chatting to the CEO? Is it just folk recommended you because they knew you had a podcast or what?
Really fortunate to have like a previous relationship with him. Like where I work, I founded and chair a network called our Social Mobility Network, and not to get all corporate on you, but it's an employee network for people that are from a lower socioeconomic background, because where I work, the financial services industry, as you know, was previously gatekept by people that went to Russell Group University or perhaps private schooling. And like statistically, especially our organisation, there was such a lower representation of people from lower socioeconomic background, and when people were there, they didn't embrace that part of their work.
Yeah.
And for him, that's such a huge importance to champion that. And because I started this network and met the Queen and all this stuff, he was actually very aware of what I did,
okay.
Which was really nice. So we had met in the past, and he became a fan of the podcast. So he's listened to the Jimmy Carr episode.
Right, okay.
A CEO of an accounting firm had listened to someone at the other side of the accounting ethics spectrum, which was hilarious. So he had listened to that episode as well.
Yeah.
And so he had listened to that episode, and everyone at my organisation knows I have a podcast. So when he came to Glasgow, it just made sense, I think, for them to have me interview him, and he enjoyed it. He had a lot of fun. He opened up with the question, am I more enjoyable, or like, are you more nervous to interview me than Jimmy Carr?
Yeah.
And I just had to turn to like everyone in the room and be like, no. I didn't mean to do that to my boss, but like obviously like, Jimmy Carr's my hero.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I didn't want to like focus too much on the balance between corporate life and comedy, but I've never spoken to someone that's in the same situation as me, like doing a podcast but also working in a stuffy environment. So they say.
I think you need to bring it in. You need to bring it in house.
Mm-hmm.
It'll make your time at work more enjoyable.
Yeah.
People will be able to connect to you more as well. If you're bringing a facade, like the ego's only available to receive praise, not love. So if you're wearing a facade at work, then when you get feedback, you're never going to be able to feel it because you're not you.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can bring the components of you, and this goes to like the listener, whether you're working in retail or you're working anywhere, bring your whole self, the self that you're proud of, to that experience, because when people try and connect with you, you can foster that real connection opposed to just leaving it dormant at surface level. So I would encourage you to bring as much as you can, or as much as you feel comfortable about, bringing that part of you to that organisation where you can. But obviously not like completely derailing your organisation through like, I don't know, weird jokes.
Just stopping work to take photos of folk. I did like what you're saying about the ego, and like you can't really take a real compliment and feel it if it's you're being fake about something, basically. And I remember you saying that in your own podcast, and I really loved that quote. And I don't know if you had the same experience when I first joined banking. Obviously I don't know people in banks. I just through chance ended up in a bank, and I was like, oh, I need to have like wear like a shirt and tie and have like this certain haircut and this certain thing. And it wasn't until I was like now we're in my 30s, and I don't give a shit. I'm going to be who I am.
And I bet people like recognise you for you now.
Yeah.
People don't know me as the amazing management consultant or like a really great accountant, because one, I'm not, but two, like we're an organisation of 18,000 of those, but there's no one else with a podcast that I know of. There's no one else that does stand-up comedy that I know of. So people know me as the kind of, the guy that does a podcast at KPMG, and people will know you for the guy that's the photographer or the podcaster too.
I thought I was going to get an insult there. I was ready for it.
The guy that looks like the fucking dropout of Nickelback. Sorry.
No, that's fine. I was almost kind of wanting it. I was like, yeah. I'm getting an insult off a comedian.
I know how I look. I look like the answer to the question, what if Anne Robinson and Paul Scholes had a premature son? It's all good, man. My hairline's that far back, it's still in Glasgow.
You get come here today with the top back.
So with your the theme of the podcast being origin stories and development by David, like how much do you think you've developed as a person through doing these podcasts? Is it carrying into your everyday life? You're more confident, or like what's the change been?
Well, like first of all, like I introduce myself as a podcaster. Like when someone says, "What do you do?" I'd never say what my corporate job is. I say
Right.
a podcaster, because I've succumbed to that identity.
Right.
Like I think when you do something long enough and you become obsessed with it, it's so important to like label yourself as that person, because then you look for both opportunities through the guise and the mind of a podcaster, but you also create habits that feed into that. So like if I'm asked to go out on a Wednesday night for a late dinner, but I know I've got a guest in the morning, I'll say no. So that's been really important, like being really single-handedly focused on one identity and one goal, and channeling so many decisions through that has been helpful to make me, especially in your 20s, there's so many distractions.
Yeah.
Like you don't have like a previous, like so I had an amazing lady called Dr. Meg G on the podcast who has got this really famous TED talk about the 20-something decade, arguing that it's the hardest decade of your life, the most uncertain decade of your life too. And it's because that you don't have previous patterns of thoughts and you don't have previous patterns of data to make informed decisions of. So when you're in your 20s, you're probably given more opportunities than any other decade in your life, and you can't make sense of that opportunity. So if you're able to pick an identity like a podcaster, be certain on that, and then filter opportunities based on that identity, it makes your 20s, the uncertain decade, more certain. So for me, having the podcasting, knowing that that's what I want to do and who I am, has allowed me to make so many decisions in my 20s and down-regulate some of that anxiety. But also like the verbal dexterity of being able to have a conversation has been so intransferable. The ability to really deeply care about a random stranger in the street that you bump into and asking like really deep questions and being able to connect fundamentally has brought more colour and flavour to my life. Having that gear has been brilliant. And then most importantly, really, the social network that I've built over the last few years has been so powerful for outcomes to my life. Like when I remember like 5 years ago, I listened to a podcast called Modern Wisdom, Chris Williamson. I've had the chance to meet him. We exchanged messages, like huge podcaster. Really lucky to have had those exchanges with him. I remember listening to one of his early episodes with a guy called Rory Sutherland. Have you come across him?
A fake Rory Sutherland account followed me on TikTok, and I was like, oh, that must be through David, and it ended up being a scam. And I was like, oh, fuck.
Let's hang on to that story. I'll tell you about that in a second, right? But Rory Sutherland on that podcast, it blew my mind. If you don't know who Rory Sutherland is, you might have seen him in your kind of TikTok feed. He's went from being like a niche guru to like a kind of gen pop recognisable voice. He's this huge behavioural scientist, author of a book called Alchemy, but he's also the chair of one of the largest advertising agencies in the world called Ogilvy. Total guru, probably the best in the world at what he does. And I listened to this one podcast, became so fascinated with him, absolutely obsessed with him, read his book, sent him a bunch of LinkedIn DMs after listening to it, sending feedback, didn't read or reply to them. And like maybe like 50 episodes into the podcast, I finally reached out to him and he finally said yes. We had such a good time on the podcast, 3 hours together. Bearing in mind, he probably charges like 10 grand an hour for a public speaking chat or something like that.
Right.
We had 3 hours together, had so much fun. He said, can we do this next week? And he came back on the week after and we did it again. And now we've done like 3 episodes together.
Oh, cool.
And we just chat on email. Like he listened to my Jimmy Carr episode, he like shares that online, he shares all my stuff. And like the ability to just pick up the phone to a guy called Roy Sutherland, who I once admired as a little kid, who had no idea who I was, and being mates with my superstars.
Yeah.
It's just been amazing, man.
That's cool.
And that's extended to people like Jimmy Carr, example, Sunita, like Simon Cowell's ex, Scotland's richest man, and then local people that have really supported the podcast. I've really found, I think, like podcasting and comedy, like one of the kind of synergies between the two is that you're in it by yourself, but you're in it together. And I've been able to like meet some amazing local people, and I've been able to meet you guys, right, through the podcast as well. So that's been like the kind of best outcome.
Yeah, 100% agree with the people we've met. One of the things you said was, when people ask you what you do now, you say a podcaster. And I recently I hate saying, oh, I work in banking, I'm in financial crime and KYC. I hate that because I know it's not me.
Really? I think that's pretty cool, mate. The hope in his eyes for a second, he was like, finally!
But, God. Basically, that exact same thing happened, right? So I was at a comedy night, and it was basically a few podcast guests were on the same night. It was Mark Black, Mikey Motion, Darren Connell,
great guys,
and then like future guests like Silas and stuff was on.
Good guys.
So I was like, what a lineup! Like, I absolutely have to go. And I think Paddy Linton came out and he was doing like crowd work before it. We actually noticed the guy from the Jackie Bird New Year video. You know that he was there, so I told my pal and he told Paddy. So it was really funny, great night. But I was like, oh, if someone asked me what I do, I'm going to say I'm a photographer. because we make money from photographs. We do like restaurants and stuff like that. We do like obviously trying to get into portraits through this podcast. This is us practicing it. So I was like, I'm going to be a photographer. And straight away he's like, yeah, but what do you actually do? And I was like, instead of being like, that's just a funny comeback, because of my issues with saying that, I was like, fuck, he's seen right through me. And I'm like, oh, I work in a bank and financial crime. And he was asking stuff, and I was like, oh, I just didn't want to say. And I was like, fuck. And it really bothered me because it's such a, I overthought it. It was just a simple comeback, which is absolutely fine, but I just overthought the fuck out of it. But it ended up that the next 5 people next to me were all bankers as well, so it was a thing on its own. But that just really bothered me. So like,
But I understand why that happens, right? Because like if you work in an organisation, right, there's a very structured hierarchy, and you can denote your status based on what position that you have or how much money you make, and it's clearly identifiable to the people around you. If you say I'm a manager, how important you are in the general society. But if you say I'm a photographer, like, does that mean you take photos on a fucking flip camera from '04?
Yeah.
Or does it mean that you have a full Blackmagic fucking setup and you take pictures of rock and roll stars? Like, they can't really denote your success. And I think maybe that's something that you're wrestling with internally, is that you don't really know where you fit in the marketplace as a photographer.
Yeah.
So when someone asks you, like, what do you do? And then they question it, you're like, well, I don't have that undeniable stack of proof that I am who I say I am.
Yeah.
And I think by just getting as much reps in as possible, being able to look... One thing that we have as a creative industry that I think is actually quite paralysing, because you're so self-sufficient, and it's also a really similar thing that people from a lower socioeconomic background have if they like transgress their socioeconomic statuses. They have a gratitude complex, or they have this weird hamstring where they compare sidewards or upwards to people that are doing the same thing as them or doing better than them, doing better at what they're doing than they are. But what they don't do is look back and see how far they've come.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they don't look back at their first photograph and see how shit it was, or their first podcast and see how shit it was, and see the like trajectory that they've been on.
Or our first 24 podcasts.
First 24 podcasts. But like, the fact that you have done 24, you are in the top by statistics 0.1%.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so many give up after episode 5, and we're kind of nerding about some of the people that have entered our market recently.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, the online PTs, I notice that they aren't purists of the form of podcasting. They have a podcast so they can chop it into 20 sound bites for Instagram, and that's fine. Like, everyone's like freedom of speech; they're allowed to have a voice, they're allowed to do what they want. However, I don't believe that the quality of those podcasts, from what I've seen, have been great. But what that does for people like us who have done 124 episodes or whatever else is that like it creates a key benchmark of what's a okay podcast or a shit podcast, and what's a really great podcast like your podcast. And I think the fact that you are now developing the stack of proof that you are who you say you are, when you're asked by a compere, what do you do, and you say a photographer, and they push back on that, you can then quite neurotically go back and think about those 24 episodes or all those photos that you've done, and then lean back in and say, I'm a photographer because I have 2 years experience.
Yeah.
Whether you say that or not, or you just think it, I think being able to like recount some of the highlights that you've had like adds a callus to that identity.
Yeah. I didn't want to, because I'd photographed like half the acts that night, I didn't want to be a wank and go like, oh, actually I'll photograph all
See that guy,
yeah.
photographer, shot him, that guy, shot him,
Yeah.
you, I'm not going to shoot you, you cunt. You know what I mean?
Because then I'm like, why am I saying this? I'm just making it about me. Like, I could just say banker and get away with it, like attention off me.
Yeah.
It was a weird one.
Well, do you know, I did this weird, people are not going to believe this is the reason I did it, but in 2022, like going back to that piece of like, you should create as much novelty and intensity in your life, I saw that a speed dating thing was rolling into Glasgow, and I was like, fuck it, I'm going to sign up for that by myself. It's going to be so uncomfortable going as a single guy by myself to a speed dating thing where predominantly most women, I'm guessing, would be going in groups for a fun night out.
Yeah.
And then like some of the guys who might be going there are unfortunately people that are struggling to find love. Not me included. No, right? But I thought that would be such a really good litmus test or split test to go in. Say there's 14 dates. You go in and present a different version of yourself to each candidate or eligible candidate, and you understand like what part of your introduction garners most interest. So like for the first 3 I would say an accountant, next 3 I'd say a stand-up comic, next 3 I'd say a podcaster, and like as you might have guessed, like the podcast or the stand-up comedy garnered way more interest than the accountant, right?
Yeah.
And you had like I really believe like if you're flirting with someone, And I really believe you should flirt with everyone, like every human that you meet. Like that's such a really great way to build charisma. But what really flirting is like world building. Like you create this kind of hyperbolic, extrapolated world together, and you kind of push and pull. It's almost like a dance. So like when I said I was a podcaster, like the girl would be like, "Oh no, another straight white guy with a podcast. Who have you had on?" And then you would say someone that's quite impressive, and then it'd be like, "Oh, right, I relate to that," and then they maybe speak about that. Like you build this world together because, like, if I said an accountant, they're not going to be like, "Oh, what's IAS 15 standard?" Like they don't know much about that industry, like to talk about it.
Yeah.
Whereas like if they talk about podcasting, they can be like, "All right, who have you had on? What do you talk about?" It's easy for them to access, and you can world build together.
Yeah. I think what you're saying about their pushback at podcasts is what I felt with photography as well, because so many photographers that are, say, like famous are absolute wanks. You read interviews with them and you're like, shut up, man. Like, you put me off being a photographer.
Do you have an example, or are you not like to...
Yeah, I've got an example. I'll tell you after.
Is it that guy?
But speaking of speed dating, that might be a good segue. Present another version of yourself. I'll maybe hand over to Big Struanova now. Cool. But yeah, I really enjoyed that. Thanks very much.
We'll have a second date.
Yeah, absolutely.
My num is bum.
How's your bum?
Fucking peachy.
See, without context. I take it, yeah. Yeah, the white lights on. I'll lose sunglasses because I don't like... I'm not trying to, like, hide myself. I don't... I mean, like, between kids on, like, skates, dogs, people playing music, like, there'll be like a sort of mass murder type thing goes on after this. It's just... you can't control your environment.
I'm glad you took the glasses off. Like, I think with the glasses on, we would look like a remake of the film Top Gun Maverick if it was shot after an acid attack. But see, to be fair, previously, Daryl and I looked like fucking Harry Potter if they both fucking smoked weed.
Like Ron has been living an accident with like a fly ball.
I loved it. That was brilliant. Oh.
So you start off your podcast quite often by asking them who they are in the current year, which is like quite a nice way of like getting a synopsis of their current state and their mindset. Who are you going to be in about 5 years, so like 2030? What do you have like a progression like in mind for where you'd like to be in terms of podcasts and just life generally?
One thing I've learned through some of the amazing guests that I've had is like the power of expectation. And if I were to say like, oh, I'm going to be fucking on Joe Rogan or have like 1 million subscribers on a podcast, or I'm going to continue comedy and perform at bigger gigs, then it's...
To take you away from living in the moment.
Living in the moment,
the most of the opportunities that come your way.
I think, like I was speaking earlier about having that guiding principle and funneling decisions through that, but if I'm solely, like, have like a single metric of success, if I don't reach that, then anything else is a failure.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, going back to the point of being able to look back and recognise your achievements and find solace and comfort and recognition in that, having such a keystone metric ahead of me will disengage me from looking back at those things. So I think I just want to continue what I'm doing, mate, to be honest, Struan.
Yeah.
Like, I'm having so much fun learning about myself through podcasting and comedy and getting to meet amazing people like you, meet amazing people in the comedy world. Like, it's such a privilege to live in my 20s, not have responsibilities, have both the physical and mental function to do these things, because I understand so many people don't.
Yep.
And some people are in environments where they're not comfortable embracing some of these things that they want to lead into, and I'm just really happy that I've been able to do that and get to meet with people that have done the same. So next 5 years, continue doing what I'm doing, and if it takes me to the moon, then it's amazing, but if it crashes and burns, then it's a fucking interesting story to tell too.
Seems unlikely you're going to crash and burn given where you're at the moment.
Maybe after this podcast, after some of the things I've said, fuck's sake.
It was quite interesting to hear you talk about your sort of journey into comedy when you're speaking to Daryl there. And it prompted, it sort of initiated the question in my mind was that, do you think comedians, because it seems like comedy was almost like a form of therapy for you, and dealing with the trauma of your mum passing, do you think other comics are using comedy as a sort of active means of therapy?
I mean, I can't really speak for them, of course. I guess people probably enter comedy for a variety of reasons. It's such a... I was listening to Sean on your podcast, and he had such a good point that even from your first gig, it's the one domain that you're instantly judged from.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, there's such a such a low but high barrier to entry. Low barrier to entry, high cost of failure.
Yeah.
Like, anyone can sign up for an open mic, but the pain of not getting a laugh is so high, and the public humiliation of that is so high. So I think most comics must have something inside of them that forces them to endure that
Yep.
ephemeral, visceral, extreme pain up front. And maybe that is trauma. Maybe that is fear of insufficiency, a lack of validation from typical circles that they've been in. Perhaps it is therapeutic for them to go up on stage and talk about some of the things that they speak about. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, because that's what therapy is, isn't it? It is about speaking through traumas or experiences or whatever it might be in your life.
But mate, if
Usually
you went to your therapist and she burst out laughing, you'd be concerned.
But in your world, or in part of your world, like, that's success.
Yeah, it is.
Is that how you view it? Like, is getting the laugh success? Some people we've spoken to, it's not the laughter isn't necessarily the successful part of it, but the telling their story the way they want to tell it as how their metric.
I mean, that's such a healthy way for them to look at it, and I think it's probably the better way to look at it. But I think because comedy is so binary, like, either people laugh or they don't.
Yeah.
It's so easy to attach yourself to the outcome. There's a reason why the highs are so high in comedy and the lows are so low, and it's because it's so uniquely distinctive. Like, I've had the privilege to do quite a lot of public speaking over the last few years, maybe like 100 public speaking gigs, and because you can't viscerally or like visibly see the impact that you're having, you can band-aid it by saying it went well. Whereas in comedy, like, if you don't get a laugh, you just know it didn't go well, or it was the wrong environment for those jokes. For me, maybe it's because I'm still new to stand-up comedy. Like, I'm not like some of the other people that you've had on the podcast. I'm still very much attached to whether they laughed or not.
What do you class as new?
Like less than 100 gigs.
Okay, so
Yeah.
in my mind, that's like you can't remember individual gigs at this point. You've done so many of them. Or can you? Can you remember every one?
Probably.
Yeah.
If I try to.
Yeah. Okay.
I definitely remember the good ones and the bad ones. That's for sure. Like,
Yeah, they still.
I remember one of my first sets where my mum.
So we just had a sort of woman like. Yeah.
No way.
I mean, she's now giving us evils. We appreciate Mabel and her input to this.
Would
but-
this do good for numbers if I punched it? No.
See, I mean, for me, it's like if you've done 100 of something. I mean, if you'd been on 100 dates, like with girls, like
Must be nice.
you'd say like you've got a reasonable track record. I mean, obviously they don't work out particularly well if you're going on 100 of them, but like within the context of like something like performing, 100 is quite a lot, I would have thought. But
Yeah.
But then again, when we speak to the people, we speak to the comedians we've had on, everyone's performing like multiple times a week, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day at times, and so they're going through there's so many iterations.
Yeah.
It's quite impressive that people are enduring with something like that.
Well, you've heard about that 10,000 hours rule, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think maybe I'm looking at it through the frame of that, like doing 10,000 hours of comedy would be way more than 100 gigs, if I'm honest. And I think it's because, like, one of my closest friends, like, total sweetheart, great guy that you've had on the podcast, Darren Connell, absolutely love that guy, cannot say a bad word about him. I remember when he came on my podcast 2 or 3 years ago, he said something along the lines of, like, you don't find your voice until you've done 100 gigs.
Right.
Or he wouldn't book someone until they've done 100 gigs. So for me, that was like the ultimate or instant benchmark of
something to aim for there.
Something to aim for. So maybe that's the reason. But even with podcasting, like, I've done 100 podcasts and people were like, holy shit, you've done 100 podcasts. I'm like, I've just got my yellow belt. I've learned how to do the fucking karate chop. I don't know. I don't know karate. Look at me, I'm a pacifist. But Yeah, like
It sounds like a lot, I think, to the outside world, 100 of anything. But we're in episode, 25 or something like that, I can't remember. And that's a year. And actually, that's not... 100 all of a sudden is not that out with the realms of like what we're doing. It's 4 times more. But it's like, it's still something all of a sudden that's achievable. Not that that's necessarily the goal.
Yeah.
The goal is to enjoy meeting with people, taking photos, and if it never gets beyond its like current level, I mean, personally speaking, I'm happy with that. Like this is the fun part. Like I'm not big. I'm not particularly driven like by the metrics, like how many views or like did we get a good like subscriber like conversion from the video or whatever. I'm not that fast.
Not to keep name dropping Jimmy Carr on this
That's
podcast.
a good name
right?
drop though. I mean, as name drops go.
Yeah. Like, people are gonna be so sick of me saying his name, right? But like, I have learned so much from him, both in that podcast and reading his book. And he was like, it's not about the journey. Sorry, it's not about the start. It's not about the end. It's not about the journey. It's about the person that you become on the way.
Mm.
And I was like, that is so true. Like the fabric of your minds, the skills that you've achieved, the people that you've connected with on this journey have ultimately been unregrettable. Even if the podcast ended today,
Yeah.
you'd be so glad that you did it. And I think that's such a good frame to look through life with, is like, do work that in retrospect you'd be glad you did.
Yes.
If you could make every decision based on that, then you'd have an amazing life.
Yeah.
Because my biggest fear is regret. That's all I care. I don't care about dying at all. I just hate the idea of being 60 or 17, looking back and be like, I wish I asked that girl out. I wish I did a stand-up comedy gig. I wish I started a podcast. I wish I tried that side hustle. Imagine being like physically and mentally incapable of doing something in your 20s you wish you did. I can't imagine a greater hell. So
Yeah.
after this, I'm going to go to a fucking handstand. I'm going to like embrace my bodily features.
Just sort of circling back then to like what you're talking about there, with some of the lessons you've learned. Is there like a standout, like from all the people you've had on, be it might be Jimmy Carr or Rory, is there something that stands out as like a lesson that if you had to go back in time and you had to instill that in an earlier version of yourself, like that'd be the thing that would push you towards like where you're currently at?
One thing I've realised recently is that there's 3 forms of intelligence, and there's one that doesn't typically ever get mentioned or credited or thought about. And this is just a revelation I've had from interviewing so many different people in their journeys. So typically we have the idea of what IQ is, like general intelligence, EQ, emotional intelligence, but I think there's a third one that people don't recognise, and it's RQ or AQ, like resilience quotient or adversity quotient.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is like IQ might be denoted to skills, right? So we can look at accounting, we know exactly what skills are required to be an accountant.
Yep.
In the public domain, everyone knows what that is. And then EQ is maybe like experience, the ability to take that one skill, apply it to multiple domains, connect with people on that skill, and demonstrate it for a period of time. So if you look at a CV, it's skills first, then experience, how many years you've demonstrated that skill. But the last thing that we don't appreciate is AQ or RQ, and that's basically, for me, the ability to maintain composure throughout hardship and the insights that one gets from that. So me and you could have completely experienced the exact same upbringing, for example. Say you and I were twins, which we're obviously not because you're way better looking than me. I'm obviously the deformed one. But if we were, like, maybe I was adopted, for example, but who would want me anyway? They give me back. But if they did, imagine we experienced the exact same experiences in a household, right? So we both had an alcoholic mother and father who were shouting at each other, and our perception of those events could be vastly different.
Absolutely,
right?
yeah.
And you could get different lessons than I could from that. And if we take that and extrapolate into the wider world, we're going to carry those experiences into environments or organisations totally differently.
Yeah.
And of course, it's hard to quantify and qualify what those lessons are. But that is intelligence for me. Like the way we personify and absorb lessons through experiences is a unique form of intelligence that we should be celebrating more. So I guess what I've learned is that third form of intelligence. And if you're able to tell your, like, retrospectively inspect your story and tell your story, that is intelligence. And whether you're Jimmy Carr or you're wee David from a council estate, we all have our own version of that intelligence. And in fact, it's a level of intelligence that no one else has. And it's your competitive advantage. So overall, I really think we should be embracing our weirdness, because by definition, like, we are 100 trillion to one. Like, the fact that our ancestors have had sex, and that's delineated into our existences, and now that we are in a fortunate environment to like experience amazing things and communicate that with a tribe and much wider than that, like that's such a unique level of insight and a fortunate piece of luck for us to be able to do that, and I think we should be embracing it. So I know that's a long-winded answer, is just to embrace your weirdness and embrace that third form of intelligence that's not widely understood.
I'm really looking forward to the offspring between you and that seal. I've never seen a ginger seal before.
I have, and I'm not going to tell you where I saw it.
But yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about intelligence in that way, because I think a lot of people see intelligence being able to pass a test, whereas actually that's just regurgitation most of the time. That's all school for me was really good for. It's a memory test, not how do you take a lesson and apply it to something bigger in your life. Like, yeah, obviously, podcasting, doing a lot of public speaking, you'd hope, like, you're obviously very articulate and you'll be able to get your ideas across in a very neat way.
Thank you.
And like, that's reps, that's 100 podcasts, it's 100 speaking engagements or whatever. Like, how many hours that amounts to? But it's not just that, it's the time you spent like thinking about how to say things, the research, etc. Like, that's just intelligence. It's just going to like gain greater and greater momentum just as time goes on.
And it kind of goes back to that identity point that we had of like being a podcaster. Like, I now know the skills required to be that person. I'm going to be cautious how I say this, because it might discourage people from trying numerous different things. But I really believe you should focus on being a superstar at one thing, or maybe at least two things, because like, you don't go to a dentist and give a fuck about how good of a golfer he is. You just want him to be a good fucking dentist.
Yeah.
You know? So there's a disproportionate amount of resources and success are attributed to someone that's top of their field. Like, there's a reason that we know of Usain Bolt and how fast he was, and there's a reason he gets Puma deals and the Virgin adverts and stuff like that, is because he was best in class at the thing he does.
Yeah.
But if you look at the statistics or you look at the data, he was only marginally faster than the person that was second. But we don't know who the fuck that is. I don't know who that is, but we know who Usain Bolt is because he was a superstar in his field. So it's better to be 1 of 1 than 10 out of 10 at something that everyone else is doing.
Who was the second person on the moon?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's
No one, because no one actually went to the moon, let's be real.
Oh, really? Are you a conspiracy theorist at all?
No, but I'm a fake one, right? So, like, when I joined, here's a weird story, right? When I joined my work, right, I took this apprentice under my wing. He was about a few years younger than me. He was a bit of an introverted guy. He was also from Prestwick. And I just started taking him on nights out and stuff like that. And we had a bit of it was hilarious, honestly. He had his first tequila shot with me. Like, I really, like, showed him the ropes. And but socially, we would do, like, hilarious things out in public. And one of the things we would do is, like, when we were drunk on a night out, we would convince randomers that we were conspiracy theorists. So one of the ones that we said were that we were Rabbie Burns conspiracy theorists. And our conspiracy was that Rabbie Burns didn't exist. And it all hinged on this one ridiculous idea. And it was the fact that there's a chip shop down Ayr Beach called the Rabbie Burns Chippy. And the argument is that the chip shops weren't around when he was there. So how the fuck did he invent one, you know? And we would like protest that argument. It was hilarious. We also said that we used to make so many different characters up. We said that we were like an ecological group of farmers that harnessed electric out of electric eels. People believed that as well. And we also said, I remember we're in Edinburgh for staff night out, and we're outside this boozer, and these girls asked like what we were up to, like why we were out, and I said it was my leaving night at work, and I used to be a butcher, but Aaron, the younger apprentice, sacked me because I made a steak pie with no sausages in it. And these girls were like, oh no, don't sack him, take it back on. Like, I love a steak pie with no sausages in it. And like we were arguing for like half an hour about the fact that he had sacked me. Anyway, what were we talking about before that? Conspiracy theorists. Man on the moon, superstars. Yeah, no
one of one, being a one of one. Like,
yeah, being a one of one.
Yeah. Okay. So it's I know what you mean, because it's like it's honing that one set of skills to be as good as you can be, and if you're not putting all your energy into that, then you can't expect to be at the top of your field unless you're an exceptional outlier. And it must be there are some out there, but
one argument that I'd love to push, and it's a very unpopular opinion, and it's not suitable to the west coast of Scotland because we have poppy syndrome, and if you don't know what poppy syndrome is, it's where in a poppy field one poppy grows too high and it's chopped down, right? We have that culture around here, and we have this fetishization of humility. I think humility is a great skill, or a great trait to have in only certain domains. If you want to be a superstar, you can't be humble. Like you can't be.
Most of the time, I agree.
You can be humble. You can be humble in how like you approach social situations. You should be humble, but you can't downplay your achievements.
But you've got to have utter belief in yourself and your skills.
And you need to echo that. It needs to be infectious.
Yeah.
Because, like, humility is only rewarded by other people that have humility, and so it's why success breeds success. But if you are outwardly performative in nature, and you have a great sense of skills, and you demonstrate that outwardly, people that also have success and resources are going to notice that and attribute that to you.
Yeah.
It's why success breeds success.
It's almost like we were talking about earlier with Darrow about flirting with people. And like I take that to mean like that's just something being charming to everyone.
Yeah.
And not just because they want to get someone's number or a promotion at work. It's just they're just being a nice person. They're being charming, like affable with people. Like it's
So
they've got an
important.
easygoing manner. It makes it easy to have conversations. Conversations open up opportunities and doors, and you go further on in the world. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it?
Success is not about performance; it's about perceived performance.
Well,
So-
yeah, because what you deem as success for your life is going to look differently to what my life is in a successful manner and what Darryl's is. And I remember talking about this with a group of people a few years ago and like saying, well, how will you know when you've made it? And someone said, like when like I don't have a mortgage or like I've got a dishwasher and I don't have to do the dishes. And it's like, well,
Is that the appliance or like a staff member?
in my household, I'm the dishwasher, so Caitlin's obviously made it. She's got me. And I was like, well, I think I kind of have made it because, like, when I was in a job I enjoy doing, we had like this like side thing going on of like starting a business and podcasts and stuff like that. Like, I'm not married, but I'm like with someone I love, like, and I wouldn't like change that for the world. So like, I'm in a bit of town that I might like to live somewhere slightly differently, but it's not like a big holdback. So like, all those like blocks in my life, like. I'm not saying like this is it now. This is as good as it's ever going to be, or there's no push. Like so, all those kind of blocks like are there, but that doesn't mean like I'm done at 30. Like I'm just happy to like live this life now. Like obviously, want to push the podcast more, like develop the business. Like then there's normal work, which is like fisheries biology for me, which is something like I'm super passionate about. That's been like my life almost since I was about 14 in a sense. So. Like all those things are there, but it doesn't mean like that's not the end point just because I feel happy in it all at the moment.
Yeah, like success is relative and it's very subjective.
Yeah.
And like much like body dysmorphia, you can get performance or success dysmorphia, and that's by like judging yourself out of shape in terms of your metrics of success by comparing your success to someone else's success. And success is so subjective in a way that people's starting points and end points are very different.
Yeah.
So one thing that I noticed that I really appreciate about my friend group, and it's probably something I really enjoy about you guys, is that you guys face voluntary discomfort. I don't know what your backgrounds is. I don't know how you, comfortable and fine your backgrounds were. I don't know how challenging they were equally. So I can't judge that, but what I can see with what you guys do is that you're doing something like this, which is so unconventional, and you're leaning into it, and I think that's such a great trait to be admired. But we don't know our peers and their starting or end points, and if we compare our journeys to theirs, then it's so easy to become dysmorphic in nature. But if you know your own and you're able to look back and take stock of your own, then the only person that you should be quantifiably comparing yourself to is a previous version of yourself.
I think that's the danger with social media, isn't it? Like it's sort of been said to death, but like it's comparisons. If you enjoy, like you end up like comparing yourself to like someone who's way fitter or stronger or better at photography or a better videographer or editor, and you're like, if all you do is follow those things and all you see is people who are better than you can take it in two ways. You can be super inspired by it, or you can get really down the dumps and say, I don't know how I'm ever going to get to that person's point. And you don't need to get to where they're at. Like, you could really focus in on being a superstar photographer and drop everything else. But maybe that's not what you want. Maybe you want to be like someone who's got a dozen different things that they're passionate about and like pursue, and like that's your lifestyle. rather than just like doubling down on this one thing. And you might get there, but equally, you might not. You might have the skills to get there, but you might not have the personality or be able to like get into those circles just because it's not your nature. But you might have the skills to back it up. You just never get to that point, and that would be seriously sad in quite a lot of ways.
It's such a good point. Like 50 years ago, the only people that our parents could really compare themselves to is like people in magazines, and they were able to like delineate themselves from those superstars. They realized the gap in the game between them.
Yeah.
Whereas now that we have an online magazine of people that are doing things that we're not, in places that we're not, with people that we're not.
Yeah.
And no one ever like posts a picture of the day they got food poisoning and are vomiting everywhere. Like the algorithm is relying on people wanting to post things for a response that is essentially, in air quotes, like me, like me, like me.
Yeah.
So the only way that people are going to feed that algorithm is by posting the most attractive, sexy, clean-cut, polished version of themselves in their lives.
Yeah.
And I think in The Social Dilemma, the person, like, do you remember the Netflix documentary? The person said that the worst mistake of his career was introducing the like button because it made every piece of online content binary.
Yeah.
So now that everyone's actions and mannerisms on those social media is to funnel that like button. But it goes back to that having that really strong sense of identity, because if you know who you are and what you do, then you can respect and appreciate someone that's like doing Forex trading in Dubai on top of a rented Lambo, because you can be like, that's not me, it's not who I am.
No.
Whereas if you don't really have a strong sense of self and you don't know who you are, then you might be thinking, maybe that should be me. Why am I not doing that? So I think that sense of identity is really important. It's a really good kind of pathfinder through the noise. Because I guess what we have now, like 50 years ago, there was a immediate sense of lack of information. You only had your parents and the people in your council estate to learn from, or a library. Whereas now that we have the opposite, we have a binge culture of information, and if you're in your 20s and you've not got that life experience or that sense of identity to kind of trailblaze through that path, then you're it's kind of sick, like you're drinking from a hose pipe, really, and it's so hard to curate and make sense of all the information.
Yeah, I think one of the problems is like all the answers to all your problems are like in the palm of your hand or in your pocket. Like it's all accessible. But the other side to that is sort of breeding a generation of people who can't solve problems, because all they need to do is be able to type what the problem is in and they'll get a YouTube fix for it and they can go and do it, rather than having to like work out how to take wallpaper off a wall or how to like mend something in the car or something like that. Like it's so easy just to like Google the answer.
AI is going to accelerate that, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It's just going to get worse.
Like the lawyers of the future, the accountants of the future, a lot of knowledge workers, previously they've had to be the people that go into like filing cabinets and look for like paperwork and scan it for a piece of information and then type it up in a machine somewhere and then send it to their boss for review, get feedback, change it and do that again. But now with artificial intelligence and this online database of infinite knowledge, they just need to write a little prompt into these systems. And yeah, that there may be an argument that people will spend more time on like strategic thinking and AI will allow people to think more. But I think like some of the shitty tasks that you need to go through are like
it's a teach you resilience, like you were talking about earlier. Like
exactly,
you've got to do those reps, and when you're starting off in a new job or a new career or whatever, then you sort of start at the bottom of the ladder, and you have to like earn your stripes. You have to earn each rung. But we're sort of like, you could almost like end up taking that away if you don't have to go through the process.
Well, there's a part of your brain called the AMCC, called the anterior mid-cingulate cortex.
Yeah,
you came across that. Have you been talking about that? Right.
Every day.
So that's, as you know, that's responsible for not doing tasks that are hard, but doing tasks you don't want to do.
Yeah.
And if
it's like a muscle, like it can actually grow, because, and it's I think similar thing with meditation, like it's going through those processes is actually causes a physical change in the structure rather than it just being, it's a software. It also becomes then a hardware element to it. Sorry, I jumped in there.
No, you described it better than I could. But I think that's going to be down-regulated over the next few years because if you think about admin, right, replying to an email, it's not sexy, it's not fun. It's something, but it's not difficult either.
No,
it's just something.
It's just
but
necessary.
you don't want to do it.
No.
And by doing it, you like build the callus of that muscle, or the muscle tissue on that muscle.
Yeah.
But if you think about people using like Google search as well for like remedying, like how to put up wallpaper in the house or how to have a difficult conversation with a partner, what that gives you is objective advice. It doesn't give you any like subjectivity.
Yeah, that's
Whereas
true.
going to a parent and saying, "Dad, how do I wallpaper this specific room that's shaped a specific way?" Like he understands like the nuances of that room.
Yeah.
Or like asking a friend who knows your partner in a time of a difficult patch of a relationship, they can give you subjective advice.
Yeah.
Whereas like just looking at Andrew Tate and saying like dump her and shag her best friend's not like the best piece of advice in that like subjective context, you know? So I think what we do lose through both this internet age or this like kind of internet of everything and now artificial intelligence is this going back to that RQ and AQ that I was speaking about, that third layer of intelligence. That whole level of intelligence comes from subjectivity and perspective.
Mm-hmm.
If we upregulate the internet knowledge bank that we use and then accelerate that through AI, we're going to lose all of that subjective knowledge.
Yeah.
Which is, in my opinion, this like underrated form of intelligence.
And that is, I was about to say, that's the form of intelligence that matters. It's not necessarily knowing the thing; it's knowing how to apply the thing. That's what's so important.
Yeah.
I've got one sort of wee question then to wrap up. Like, you're obviously like super busy, like got a lot of different projects on the go. How do you do you have a format for like switching off and relaxing, or is there enough like pleasure and like lack of bloody planes? I mean, see, between screaming kids, dogs, grannies, planes, people in cars, I'm fucking sick of it. How do you relax is the question.
This podcast is sponsored by Headspace.
It'll be after this.
Look, I think it's a good question. Like, so many people have this subjective idea of what relaxation looks like, right? They say you need to be eating junk food, watching Netflix, doing fuck all, scrolling
I fucking
TikTok.
hate that. That's people's form of self-love.
Exactly, and it's actually, that's not kindness.
No, I think I know exactly what you're going to say next, and I love it.
It's kind of like the kind of Jordan Peterson thing, right? Because future you has to deal with the repercussions of eating junk food, sitting on the couch, not being active. For me, like doing this is relaxing. This is what I would like. I would choose to do this rather than sitting on the couch, right?
Yeah.
And this nourishes my soul. I think what people should be doing is not a time audit, but an energy audit. Instead of looking how, like, what tasks are like draining your time, look at what tasks are draining your energy.
Yeah.
For me, watching Netflix following a plot line is work, in the same way that researching a guest by watching a podcast is work.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically the same visual content, just a different subject. I would much rather be watching a podcast. So for me, comedy, like going up on stage and having people laugh at you, is so nourishing to the soul. Being able to shoot a podcast, read a book, do all these things is nourishing for the soul. I would much rather be doing that than relaxing.
So
That
you
is
basically
relaxing.
set your life up so that everything you do is pushing you forward and it's not a drain on you.
And absolutely fuck anyone that tells you that that's like toxic
Like,
productivity.
you need to have time off to. You don't. If you find the right things, you don't need to have the downtime, because the things you do with the people you do them with are the things that keep you going.
There's a reason it's called downtime, because you're down regulating yourself. Like, I'd rather have uptime where I'm feeling the best version of myself, doing things that give me like
Energy and inspiration.
novelty and intensity.
Yeah.
Because it nourishes the soul. So fuck anyone that like. Well, and but maybe that like Netflix does that for that person, and that's totally fine.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we as a group of people here today are probably all very similar in our outlook in life, but there are other people who do need that time to sit and scroll mindlessly on a phone, and that's there. I don't know. I've sort of would argue that it's not good for you. But there's plenty of people who would argue otherwise, and I'm not here to change other people's
Well,
minds about how they
I never
want to
come
act.
off TikTok and go, fuck me, I feel amazing.
Yeah.
Fuck me, I'm going to go run a fucking marathon now. I actually feel like ambiently sick after coming off TikTok. You know, I feel like I've got like a mental flu.
I'm not on it. Instagram is the only one really that I use now.
And Grindr, obviously.
Well. We'll put a link to our Grindr page in the description below. Hey, there's 3 of us involved in this. Don't you try and back out of it now.
This is the weirdest swingers club I've ever been to.
Well, I think people throwing litter at us from behind is like. It's been a pleasure.
It's been so much fun, thank you.
And yeah, I know, we're out of time. You've got to get back up to Glasgow because you're doing a podcast tonight.
I'm doing a podcast tonight. I'm on Fake Taxi tonight. I'm on Fake Taxi. There's a guy called Darren Levy who runs a kind of semi-viral TikTok and YouTube account called Funny Uber Rides. He's from Australia and he's in Glasgow. So I'm joining him in his fake taxi, fake Uber, hopefully not having unprotected sex and hopefully filming a podcast.
Well, just make sure it's protected.
Well, he's from Australia, right? All the koalas have chlamydia, so
Yeah.
I don't want to be the first person that gives him it. I hope that's the koala's job, right? I know, but I'm shooting back to do that tonight. And look, guys, Daryl, Struan, Dallin. This has been a real privilege because I'm a huge fan of the podcast. It's a real intimate, unique, pure format of podcasting. I really hope it does really well. You guys are already way past some of the new entrants. I really hope it really kicks off, and I'm really glad that you invited me. Like, I actually invited myself almost onto this podcast. I just told you guys I'm a huge fan. I'd love to be on it someday. So hopefully the audience found it valuable, but most importantly, like, I hope you guys enjoyed having me on. And
We found it valuable, and that's all that really matters to me. The audience, I think that's the thing. Like, if people get anything from it, it's great, and they will follow it, and that'll be the crowd that follows. And it's inspiring, it's valuable to us. So I appreciate your kind words massively, and wish you all the success in the world.
keep doing it, please.
Hopefully we can do this again soon.
I'd love to.
Shall we touch muffs?
The second time you've talked.
That was awesome.